The night watchman made his round with a lantern that swung low over oil-stained planks. The hoisting works of the Grand Central Mine were never quiet after dark. Iron ticked as it cooled. Belts eased on pulleys. Somewhere beneath the timbered roof, the flywheel of the Cornish pumping engine sighed and settled. It was May 26, 1886, and the building on the south edge of Tombstone's silver field held the most expensive promise the town had ever made. Pumps big enough to beat the water that had come up to meet the men. He paused, sniffed, and caught something that wasn't steam or grease. He stooped with the lantern and saw a thin line turning orange where sawdust had gathered under a timber brace. He looked up, saw flame walking the wood, and shouted into the dark. The first bell clanged once. The second came on its heels. By the time he reached the door, fire was already moving along the rafters like it had always known the way. Men ran in from the yard, some in shirt sleeves, some pulling boots as they moved. The engineer on duty tried to keep his head. He dumped the safety, killed the steam, and shouted to spin the injector, anything to save the heart of the plant. The pumps that had kept Tombstone's mines alive for 2.5 years thumped twice more and then went still. Outside, the hose cart rattled into place. Sparks lifted on the draft and blew east over the flat like a swarm of fireflies. Stacks coughed cinders that landed on the shingle roof and stuck there, smoking. Someone yelled for sand. Another called for blankets. The men formed a line and passed up what they had, but heat slapped them back off the platform. Tombstone knew fire too well. In 1881, the business district had gone up in a cigar and whiskey flash. In 1882, a blaze jumping Fremont Street had eaten more than 100 buildings and left a grid of chimneys in the dust. The town rebuilt twice, this time in more adobe and brick, as if masonry alone could teach flame new manners. Those were street fires, though. Saloons, stores, hotels, whole blocks. This was different. This was the machinery keeping the mines open. If the pumps died, the mines drowned. And if the mines drowned, the town that still called itself too tough to die would learn what the word tough really costs. Inside the hoisting house, resin-pitched timbers went off like kindling. The sound changed from a wooden roar to a deep, ruined undertone as the engine's ironwork heated red and sagged. The engineer saw the great rod bow and knew what it meant. There would be no patch, no quick fix from San Francisco, no easy restart. The pump frames were slumping where they stood. When one crosshead warped, something heavy dropped and the floor went. The watchman who had raised the alarm stumbled, caught a sleeve on a protruding bolt, tore free, and came out coughing and blind with smoke. Later he would remember the smell, burnt pine, hot oil, and a touch of something like pennies on the tongue, and the way the roof gave a single long groan before it folded. By dawn, the Grand Central hoisting works were a blackened grid of stubs. Iron lay twisted where the engine had stood. The head frame was a silhouette of charcoal. Water had run from hoses and steam lines and lay in shallow ponds around the foundations, turning ash into paste. Men from the contention and tough nut mines drifted in to look and say nothing. The pumps in those shafts depended on the same fight with the same water table. Managers came by later with tight mouths and little notebooks. They knew what it would take to rebuild, weeks just to clear, months to cast and ship, and money no one in town had in that moment. The pumps that kept the ore above water were gone. 2 years earlier, when the first floods had beaten the 400-foot level, Tombstone had done something ambitious. They'd bought Cornish engines big as houses and set them over the Grand Central and the contention. By February 1884, the pair were lifting hundreds of thousands of gallons a day, and the newspapers crowed about the flow of silver and wages returning up Allen Street. Steam, iron, and nerve had held the line. The town's storefronts filled again. Teams hauled timbers through the dust for new shafts. Church bells rang on Sundays. The birdcage roared at midnight. People said Tombstone had survived worse, but the pumps were all that made it true. Now doors opened to quiet kitchens where miners' wives waited for a whistle that didn't come. In the boarding houses above Toughnut Street, coffee cooled untouched. At the assay offices, men stood in doorways with hands in pockets, watching a smudge of smoke on the south side. The telegraph chattered toward Benson with questions and came back with prices, silver at 90 cents an ounce. The owners in San Francisco and back east did their own math. Rebuild the burned plant at great expense while prices slipped, or cut their losses and let the water win. It wasn't a decision made at street level. It arrived by wire. The firemen wrote their report, cause uncertain, damage total. The city council talked compensation and got nowhere. The hoist and engines were company property, and the company men were far away. The Tombstone epitaph printed the facts in the clipped language of a town that had learned how to look pain in the face. Hoisting works razed, pumping plant destroyed, operations suspended. In saloons that had once stayed open around the clock, dealers watched doors and cut games short when no one new walked in. At Schieffelin Hall, the piano fell quiet between songs, the player looking up as if expecting someone to interrupt with good news. No one did. Water began to climb. First it filled the stopes at the low levels men had just started to open when the pumps were running hard. Then it lapped at galleries where candle stubs were still stuck in the rock, and a pair of gloves lay in the dust where a man had set them down. In the Grand Central, the sump tracked the rise, inch by inch, day after day, a slow drowning measured on a damp timber with a knife mark and a date. The contention kept at it for a while with its own pump, hoping to hold. Then a watchman's carelessness there sparked a fire that finished what the first blaze had begun. After that, men walked out with their dinner buckets and didn't come back. On Allen Street, the change showed in small absences. Wagons that once hauled ore to the mills along the San Pedro stopped grooving the dust. The clatter from blacksmith shops eased. The night crowds thinned at the Crystal Palace. Merchants who had extended credit during the good months began to look over customers' shoulders when they walked in. A few businesses held on. Some reinvented themselves for travelers who came to see the place where a gunfight had made men famous. But this was a mining town. Without ore, everything else looked like a memory trying to keep warm. Families made plans in kitchens with lamps turned low to save oil. Some talked about Fairbank and the railroad north. Others spoke of Bisbee, where copper was still paying. A prospector packed his gear at dawn and left town by way of Goose Flats, the same way Ed Schieffelin had walked in with a sample sack and a stubborn streak. A dance hall girl folded 3 dresses into a carpet bag and told the madam she'd been offered work in Tucson. A Cornish engineer wrote home that the great engines had fallen quiet and there was no sign they'd ever sing again. The town did not die in a day. It bled out over months that were hot, and then cold, and then hot again. There were holidays and parades because people insisted on having them. There were weddings. There were even baptisms. But each season took another layer of noise away. When 1887 came on, the head frames were silhouetted against the sky like gallows, and men avoided looking at them longer than they had to. Lawmen found less to do. Gamblers stopped bragging about the size of their tables and started talking about the weather. People would later say Tombstone had always been dramatic, that it liked to announce itself with a boom or a gunshot. The fire that ended its rebirth was not theatrical. It was a working-day blaze in a timbered house around a set of pumps made to do one boring, necessary job. It was hot, hard, and fast. It made parts sag and men cough. It took the one thing the town needed to stay what it had been. When the smoke cleared, everybody understood. The mines were underwater. The money would not come back to fight it. The town that had rebuilt after 2 great street fires could not rebuild this. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.